It started with nothing more than a smirk. The kind of smirk you can feel even when you're looking at the floor. Sophie sat in the back row, her pencil hovering over her notebook as the chalk screeched across the board. The equation was massive, letters, numbers, exponents sprawling across 3 whole panels. The teacher stepped back, clapping his hands theatrically, chalk dust swirling around him. "There it is," he said smugly. "One of the most famous unsolved proofs in modern mathematics. If anyone here thinks they're smarter than the experts who've tried and failed for 50 years, now's your chance." The class chuckled nervously, and that's when his eyes landed on her. "You, Sophie," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Why don't you give it a try? You've been awfully quiet all semester. Surely you have something to contribute." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Sophie froze. Her face turned crimson as every pair of eyes fell on her. Slowly, she shook her head. "Didn't think so," the teacher said, his smirk deepening. "Quiet as a mouse, like always." He turned back to the board, but Sophie's pencil started moving. "What would you do if you were her? Stay quiet, or stand up and prove yourself? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what you'd do in that moment." At first, nobody noticed. Then one student sitting nearby glanced over and froze. Sophie's notebook was filling up, line after line, symbols and numbers flowing effortlessly from her pencil. Her hand didn't even hesitate. The student nudged his friend, who nudged another. Slowly, the whispers began to ripple through the room. And then Sophie stood. Her notebook still open in her hands, she walked silently to the front of the room. And without asking permission, she started writing on the board. The chalk felt surprisingly light in her fingers. Sophie didn't look at the teacher, didn't look at the students. Her focus was only on the board. The numbers and letters that had once seemed so intimidating to everyone else now flowed from her mind like water. She started at the top right corner, neatly boxing off sections as she worked, step by step. Each line she wrote connected to the next like a perfectly woven thread. The class fell completely silent. Even the students who normally whispered and giggled sat motionless, eyes fixed on her hand gliding across the chalkboard. And the teacher just stood there. At first, his arms were crossed and his smirk was still there. But as she filled in line after line, his brow furrowed. Then he leaned closer. Then his jaw tightened. It was the first time anyone in the room had ever seen him speechless. Sophie paused only once to flip through her notebook, checking something she'd already scribbled earlier. Then she nodded slightly to herself and kept going. The students' eyes darted from the board to the teacher and back again. Nobody laughed now. Nobody even breathed too loud. If you were sitting in that classroom, watching her, how would you feel? Surprised? Proud? Maybe even a little ashamed of how you judged her? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd react in this moment. It took less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes for her to reach the final step. And when she boxed in the last number and set the chalk down, there was nothing left to say. She turned around, her eyes finally meeting the teacher's. He stared at the board, then at her, then back at the board. The smirk was gone. And for the first time, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's correct." Gasps filled the room. Sophie didn't smile. She didn't even flinch. She just walked back to her desk quietly and sat down. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. No one even seemed to know how to move. Sophie sat at her desk, quietly sliding her notebook shut, her hands folded neatly in her lap. All around her, classmates exchanged wide-eyed looks. A few mouths hung open. Even the usual jokesters in the back sat frozen, their usual smirks erased by something else entirely: awe. The teacher still hadn't said a word. He stood at the front, staring at the board as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His hand twitched like he wanted to grab the chalk himself and double-check every step. But he didn't, because deep down, he already knew. She was right. Finally, one student, a girl near the window, began to clap. The sound was small at first, but then another joined in. And another. And then the whole room erupted in applause. Sophie didn't turn around. She didn't need to. But for the first time all semester, a faint, shy smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Even the teacher finally managed to clear his throat and mutter, "Well, perhaps I misjudged you, Miss Clark." Sophie glanced up at him with a calm, quiet expression and said, "Yes, sir. You did." The class erupted in cheers this time, and even a few desks thumped as kids pounded them in excitement. For once, the quiet girl was the loudest presence in the room. Be honest. Have you ever watched someone you underestimated completely surprise you? Or maybe you were the one who shocked everyone. Tell your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how it felt. As the bell rang and students began to file out, the teacher remained by the board, still staring at her solution. And Sophie simply slung her backpack over her shoulder, nodded politely, and left the room. Like nothing had happened at all. But everyone else knew better. The hallway felt different when she stepped into it. For once, no one shoved past her. No one whispered behind her back. Instead, heads turned. People actually moved out of her way. And as Sophie made her way to her next class, she heard fragments of conversations following her like ripples on a pond. She really did it. The teacher just stood there. She's smarter than all of them. For the first time, she allowed herself a little more of a smile. She hadn't done it for them. Not for their approval. Not even to embarrass the teacher. She'd done it to prove something to herself. That her quiet didn't mean she didn't matter. That just because people didn't see her, didn't mean she wasn't there. And now, they all saw her. Later that afternoon, the teacher stopped her in the doorway as she passed his classroom again. He didn't smirk this time. Instead, he looked her in the eye and said, "You've taught me a valuable lesson today, Miss Clark. Don't stop surprising people." She simply nodded and kept walking, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulder. That night, sitting at her desk at home, Sophie opened her notebook one more time. She flipped to a clean page, clicked her pencil, and at the top of the sheet wrote, "The next problem." Because she already knew, there would always be another. And she'd be ready. Now it's your turn. Have you ever felt invisible and then finally proved to yourself and everyone else just how much you're capable of? Tell your story in the comments. You never know who you might inspire.